So I have a presentation, shows you all the notes, and you'll have to copy some stuff down when you see it on the screen. That's how our notes work.
Where do you copy it down?
Onto the pages in that yellow packet that will look just like what's on the screen. So the first page is the title page. Second page, it has some vocabulary. We're not going to go over those vocabulary words right now. They're just there sort of for your own reference that you can look back at it if you need to remember what some of the definitions that are part of this unit might be helpful as you're studying for your quiz on Friday.
What student number are we? Or we
You're my number 1 student. All right, so let's start with an example. So let's say a scientist wants to study the effects of light color, red and blue light, on how plants grow. And so she sets up an experiment. And the experiment is shown at the top of this page. You have plant 1, plant 2, and it shows you how the experiment was set up. She grew 2 plants under the conditions shown in the drawing. And then at the end of the experiment, plant 1 grew 10 centimeters. Measured their height. Plant 2 grew 5 centimeters. So she concluded plants will grow better under red light. So what do you think about that, about this experiment? Is that a good conclusion? Is this a well-designed experiment? Who wants to give me their opinion? What do you think? Emma?
No,
How come?
because she kept both the plants in different, the temperature was different, and she gave the one that grew more, she gave that one more water, so it's gonna grow better, and it was warm in there, so it'd grow better.
Okay, so plant 2 had a lower temperature and had less water than plant 1. And that could lead to some problems. Anything else that's incorrect, Matt?
There are 2 different types of plants.
Yeah, plant 1 was a lily, plant 2 is a rose, so they're 2 different types of plants. Okay. Anything else, Tatum?
They were set up for 2 different time periods.
Yeah, plant 1 got 2 weeks to grow, and plant 2 got 1 week. So do we know, so her conclusion, plants grow better under red light. Is that a correct conclusion based on this? No. Do we know if they grew better under red light? Not really. Because all those other factors could have influenced the growth of the plant. Obviously, more time, more water, warmer temperature, those things could affect how the plant grew as well. So how could we improve her experiment? How would we alter it or modify it to make this a better experiment? Adeline?
Because you're testing the light, you don't need to change all the other factors to equal. So like 20C, the temperature needs to be 50, they both need to be the same. Just change everything else to make it so they're equal.
Okay, good. Yeah, to set up this experiment properly, is it okay if the light color is different?
Yeah, that's what you're testing.
Yeah, that's what she's testing. So we still have plant 1 under red light, plant 2 under blue light. But then, as Natalie said, we would then want all of the other factors to be the same. We want them to be the same temperature. We want them to be have the same amount of water. We would want them to have the same amount of time. And obviously be the same type of plant. So if the experiment had been set up this way, and she got the same results, then could we be more confident in her conclusion?
Yeah.
Yes. But the way it's originally set up, we don't know, is it the water that affected the plants? was it the temperature or the color of light? We really don't know, because they were all different. And so as we're gonna learn today and tomorrow, in order to have a well-designed experiment, really, you only want one thing to be different between your groups. Everything else you want to be the same. All right, so when scientists are trying to gather some new information, so when scientists want to gather some new information, they follow some steps. Now, we sort of will talk about it saying that there are 6 steps of the scientific method. But really, scientists can use lots of different ways of finding out information. But for our purposes, we're going to talk about just one scientific method. And this method has 6 steps. Have you guys learned these before? You know, some people have been saying today that they did learn them last year or 2 years ago, but some people did not. Does this look familiar to anybody? No? Okay. Well, you're going to have to memorize these steps in the proper order. So to help you with that, we have this saying: people really hate elephants on cars. And if you could remember that saying, you could remember the steps, because the first letter of each one stands for one of the steps. Okay, if you look at this picture here of Mr. Arcuri standing on the car, then that might help you to remember that sentence. Okay, so the P, what do you think the P stands for? Abby?
Problem?
Yeah, it's the problem. And we'll talk about what these steps mean in a couple minutes, but for now we'll just list them. Yeah, P stands for the problem. Does anyone have an idea what the R might stand for? Gavin? Not quite. Nathan? No. Tatum? Research. I think we probably all know what the H stands for. Zachary?
Hypothesis.
Hypothesis. About the E. Matt?
Experiment.
Experiment. The O. Connor?
Observation.
Observation. That leads us to our last one, the C. Micah?
Conclusion.
Conclusion, yes. So those are our steps of the scientific method: problem, research, hypothesis, experiment, observation, and conclusion. So you will have to know those for Wednesday's quiz, be able to write them all out. It's a big elephant or a small car? Both.
Both.
Probably both.
Volkswagens are very small.
Yeah. All right, so what do these steps actually mean? This is on your next page. So the problem. Scientists try to solve problems. Now, how could you describe the problem? Anyone have any ideas? Tatum?
Something you need to figure out.
Yeah, something you need to figure out. And in science, the problem is in the form of what? Not quite an argument.
How?
It's in the form of a question. It's a question a scientist wants to answer. So for example, in that plant experiment we were just talking about, what do you think the problem was that the girl was designing her experiment about? What question was she asking? Natalie?
She was asking if it changes, like red light or the blue light changes how how the plant grows.
Yeah, would red or blue light change how a plant grows? That's the question she was asking. That's what she was trying to figure out using her experiment. So we start with the problem. Then we move on to the research step. And research is when the scientist is trying to find out some background information about the problem. Okay? So gathering information that's going to help the scientists to make and design their experiment. So, in that plant experiment, what kind of research do you think the scientist had to do before she could set it up? What kind of background information would she need to know? James?
She didn't know how much water to give each plant.
Yeah, like how much water those types of plants she was going to use, how much water do they need? She would have to know that so she could keep them alive throughout the experiment. What else would she have to know? Nathan?
How much light they need.
Yeah, how much light? Do they need direct sunlight, shade? Tatum?
How much light is too harmful?
What? Yeah, how much might be too much light or too little light? So yeah, those are all sort of things that she would want to know before she could set up her experiment so that she's sure it's a good experiment. That's the research step. From there we move to the hypothesis. And you guys, if I ask you with a hypothesis, you will all give me the same answer, right? An educated guess. But I don't like that answer anymore. That was good in elementary school. So it's your educated guess about what?
Experiment.
What about it?
To find a guess that has to try to get more background information.
No, you had it the first time. James?
A hypothesis is what you think is going to happen before you actually do it, and if that works out, then you're correct, and if it doesn't, you keep trying until your hypothesis is correct.
So the first part of that's perfect. So yeah, it's what you think is going to happen. Before you even do the experiment, you come up with your hypothesis about what you think is going to happen. What's a word we could use for that? What you think is going to happen in the future, we call that a what? Prediction. Your hypothesis is a prediction you make about your experiment, about what you think is going to happen. Before you even set it up, you come up with your hypothesis. And a lot of times we will phrase our hypothesis as an if something, then something statement. But what's important, it's never a question. We never use a question for a hypothesis. It has to be a statement. So in that plant experiment, what could the girl's hypothesis have been? Gavin?
The red light is going to work more than the blue light.
Well, let's be just a little more specific. What do you mean by work?
It's going to help the plant grow more.
Yeah, maybe her hypothesis, the plants will grow taller when they're grown under red light. That would be a hypothesis. She's predicting what's going to happen in her experiment before she's actually even set it up. So that's what the hypothesis, your prediction. And then you actually can get to the experiment. As you guys told me today, an experiment is done in order to what? Why do we do experiments? To Abby?
Like to test to see if the thing you're experimenting.
To test the
Thing?
not thing, we just talked about it. An experiment tests your
Problem?
Prediction.
hypothesis. Yeah. It's a series of steps we take, procedure, that helps us test our hypothesis, to allow us to say, okay, I made this prediction before the experiment. Was I right or was I wrong? Is my hypothesis correct or is it incorrect? So you set up your experiment. You run your experiment. And you guys fix the experiment with the plants to make it a better experiment. And then as your experiment is going along, you get to the next stage, the observation stage. When you're observing your experiment, what are you doing? What does it mean to observe your experiment? Nathan?
Watch it and take notes.
Take notes, like what kind of, in the plant experiment, for example, what observations would the girl have made?
How tall was one of the blue light plant?
Yes.
Versus the red?
She was observing the height of the plants. The observation stage is when you actually collect your data from the experiment. So in the plant experiment, the girl was collecting the height of the plants. She'd measure them with a ruler or something. And finally, that leads to the conclusion. So in scientific method, what do you do once you reach the stage of a conclusion? Micah?
It's the result of the project.
Well, not quite. I would say the observations, the data you're collecting is more the results. In the conclusion, you use the results to do something. What do you use them to do? Zachary?
Write something and send it out to other scientists so they could review it.
Okay, that would be a part of maybe a little after, but that's not quite, you would do that after you make your conclusion. Gavin?
It's to see if your hypothesis was correct.
Yeah, it's when you determine, you say, okay, here are my observations, here's what I saw, here are the heights of the plants, and I look back at my hypothesis, my prediction. I say, okay, well, was my prediction right? Sometimes it's right, sometimes it's not right. Okay? That's what you do in the conclusion. You decide if the hypothesis was correct or not. And those are the steps of the scientific method: problem, research, hypothesis, experiment, observation, conclusion. And so you'll have to know the steps, you'll have to know a little bit about them, and you're going to have to apply them to some actual experiments. And that's what we'll do next. Yeah?
Like for the quiz, if you don't word them specifically correct and you get the gist of it, does it still count?
Yes. You don't need like word for word definitions. All right. So let's look at maybe an example. Let's say we want to do an experiment, this is on the next slide, with mice. Let's say the problem for our experiment is going to be, would mice grow larger if they're given extra vitamin C? Anybody take vitamin C in the morning because of vitamin
I take it after dinner.
after dinner? So the question that we're asking in this experiment, our problem is, do mice gain weight if they're given extra vitamin C? Does anyone notice a problem with the picture on this page? It's a rat, not a mouse.
I was thinking it was rat. You can't tell us because it's black.
All right, so let's say we want to do this experiment. What kind of research might we need to do before we can actually set it up? Gavin?
You have to buy vitamins and buy all the research tools you need
Yeah?
to prepare the experiment.
Yeah, I need to buy all that stuff. I need to know kind of what I'm going to need, know what kind of cage works best to keep mice in and so forth. What else would I have to know? Tatum?
How much vitamin C will kill a rat
Yeah, I want to figure out sort of what's the lethal dose of vitamin C for mouse, because I don't want to give them too much. I want to keep them alive still. Maybe want to know what types of breeds of mice I might be able to use. Where can I get them? All that sort of background information is part of the research step. Just figuring all that stuff out so that you could actually set your experiment up. You'd have to know a lot of different things. Okay, so once you've done that, it's time for you to formulate your hypothesis. So what might a hypothesis be in this experiment? Bless you. What might be a hypothesis somebody's testing in this experiment? No?
I would say because vitamin C are in vegetables, I would think that the animal would gain vitamin C.
So you think mice will grow larger if they're on vitamin C? Is that what you're saying? So we often will phrase this as like if something, then something. So one way to phrase it, if mice are given extra vitamin C, then they will grow larger. That could be your prediction. And we could figure out, using this experiment, we will figure out if that hypothesis is actually correct. So how could I actually do this? Like how would I set, if I want to do this experiment in this room tomorrow, or not, but how would I set it up? What would I do? Keep from the same 3 or 4 people. How about some new participants here? Anybody else? I mean, how would I set this experiment up? What would I actually do? Ariana? Okay. What would I do? How would I have in this room?
Vitamin C and cage and rat.
Okay. Just one cage, one rat? 2 cages? 2 rats? How would I treat those 2 rats differently? How?
But you just did one vitamin C and then just feed it on.
Yeah. So we'd have 2 groups of rats. One would get normal food. One would get the normal food plus the extra vitamin C. And so I'd keep them for a while. Then what would I do after like a few weeks? Becker?
Check their weight. Then, well, before you feed them vitamin C, you put them on a scale and see how much they weigh. And after a time period, put them on a scale again and see how much they weigh.
Good. Now, I only see one problem with the experiment as we described it. I have my 2 cages, I have a mouse in each cage, giving them regular food, giving them some vitamin C. Does anyone see one possible problem? Yeah?
If they only have no boys or nothing to take into consideration, I guess they might gain more weight from being lazy or
Okay, but if they're the same, that's okay, right? As long as I don't have toys in one cage and not in the other.
yeah.
So if they're both bear cages, that's okay. If they both have toys in them, that's okay, as long as it's the same. James? So what's the problem with the way we are talking about this experiment?
They might weigh different weights before you give them food.
Okay, I would want to make sure that was the same. How about what if one happened to just be like a fast-growing rat or mouse? Maybe the difference isn't caused because of the vitamin C, it's just because that one happened to be a faster-growing rat. How could we get around that problem?
Get around the same age group,
Okay.
the same types.
Yeah? Maybe?
Rats fight from the same litter.
Yeah. The problem is here with the number. Is 1 rat in each group a good amount for a good experiment? No, because one might just be some weirdo rat that doesn't grow very big. We get around that by having what we call a large sample size. Instead of having one rat in each cage, maybe we have 20 rats getting regular food, 20 rats getting extra vitamin C. Now it's a better experiment. Now when we have our results, we can be more confident that they're correct. So having just one of each, or in our plant experiment, having just one of each plant, that's not enough data. We need many plants growing to be sure of our results. So in our experiment, we should have two groups. One group, so not just two rats, two groups of rats. One group that gets the normal amount of vitamin C, and one group gets, twice as much, 3 times as much, whatever you want. And then we measure their weight eventually. That leads us to our observation step. If you remember back to the observation, this is when we gather our information, we collect our data. So what are we observing in this experiment? What would we be looking at? Gavin?
You'd be looking at if a rat is heavier with more vitamin C than the rat with a normal amount.
Right, so what are we measuring?
Weight.
The weight of the rat. So we would observe, let's say we observe it after 2 weeks, the vitamin C rats and the regular rats are the same weight. So if we find the vitamin C rats and the regular food rats are the same weight after 2 weeks, what would our conclusion be? Veda?
It doesn't make a difference if a rat has more vitamin C than it doesn't.
Yeah, so my hypothesis that I have up here, what would you say about it?
It's not true.
It's not correct. For this example, my hypothesis was not correct. Is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah, it's fine. I don't need to change my hypothesis or redo my experiment. Have I still learned some important information? Yeah, I've learned that vitamin C doesn't affect the weight of rats. So it's still valuable even though my prediction was incorrect, and that's okay. All right, any questions about any of the steps of the scientific method? We're gonna leave off there for a minute. Tomorrow we'll talk a little bit more about variables and groups and look at some practice, and then we'll do a couple experiments this week to help us understand these steps.